Lecture 6, A Poet's Creed.
Ladies and gentlemen, my purpose was to speak about a poet's creed. But looking into myself, I have found that I have some faltering kind of creed. Perhaps it may be useful to me, but hardly to others. In fact, I think of all poetical theories as being mere tools for the writing of a poem, and I suppose there should be as many creeds, as many religions as the poets. So, though at the end I will say something about my likes and dislikes as to writing of poetry, I think I will begin by some personal memories. The memories not only of a writer, but also of a reader. For really, I think of myself as being essentially a reader. But, of course, as you are aware, I have ventured into writing, but I think that what I have read is, of course, far more important than what I have written. For one reads what one likes, and one writes not what one would like to write, but what one is able to write. My memory carries me back to a certain evening, some 60 years ago, to my father's library in Buenos Aires. I see him, I see the gaslight. I could place my hand on the shelves. I know exactly where to find Burton's Arabian Nights and Prescott's Conquest of Peru, though, of course, the library exists. It's no longer. And I go back to that already ancient South American evening, and I see my father. I'm seeing him at this moment, and I hear his voice saying words that I understood not, but yet that I felt. And those words came from Keats, from his ode to a nightingale. And of course, I have reread them ever so many times, as you have, but I think I will go over them. I think it might please my father's ghost if he's around. The verses I remember are those that you're recalling at this moment. Thou wast not born for death, immortal bird. No hungry generations tread thee down. The voice I hear this passing night was heard in ancient days by emperor and clown. Perhaps the self-same song that found a path towards that heart of Ruth, when sick for home she stood in tears amidst the alien corn. Well, of course, I thought I knew all about words, all about language. When one is a child, one feels that one knows many things, but those words came as a revelation to me. Of course, I did not understand them. How could I understand those lines about birds, about animals being somehow eternal, timeless, because they live in the present, and we are mortal because we live in the past and in the future, because we remember a time when we did not exist, and we foresee a time when we shall be dead. Well, those verses came to me, but they came to me through their music. I had thought of language as being, let's say, a way of saying things, of uttering complaints, of saying that one was glad or sad or so on. And then, when I heard those lines, and I've been hearing them, in a sense, ever since, I knew that language could also be a music and a passion. And thus was poetry revealed to me. I have toyed with an idea, the idea that though a man's life is compounded thousands and thousands of moments and days, yet those many instants and those many days may be reduced to a single one. The moment when a man knows who he is, when he sees himself face to face. I suppose that when Judas kissed Jesus, if indeed he did so, he felt at that moment that he was a traitor, that to be a traitor was his destiny, and that he was being loyal to that evil destiny. We all remember the red badge of courage, the story of the man who does not know whether he's a coward or a brave man. And then the moment comes and he knows who he is. And when I heard those verses of Keats, I felt that that was a great experience. I've been feeling it ever since, and perhaps since then, I suppose we may exaggerate for the purposes of a lecture, perhaps since then I thought of myself as being literary. That is to say, many things have happened to me, as to all men. I have felt joy in many things, for example in swimming, in riding, in looking at a sunrise or a sunset, in being in love, and so on. But somehow, the central fact of my life has been the existence of words and the possibility of weaving those words into poetry. At first, of course, I was only a reader, or rather, I think that the happiness of a reader is beyond that of a writer. For a reader need feel no trouble, he need feel no anxiety, he's merely out for happiness, and happiness, when you're a reader, is frequent. Thus, before I go on to speaking of my literary output, I would like to say a few words about books that have been important to me. And I know that this list will abound in omissions, as all lists do. In fact, the danger of making a list is that the omissions stand out, and that people think of you as being insensitive. I spoke a few moments ago about the Arabian Nights, and I spoke of Burton's Arabian Nights. But when I really think about the Arabian Nights, I am thinking not of those many and ponderous and pedantic or rather stilted volumes, but of what I may call the true Arabian Nights, the Arabian Nights of Galland and perhaps of Edward William Lane. I have done most of my reading in English. Most books have come to me through the English language, and I am duly grateful for that privilege. When I think of the Arabian Nights, the first feeling I have is a feeling of a vast freedom. And yet, at the same time, I know that the book, though vast and free, is limited to a few patterns. We have, for example, the number 3, very frequently. And we have no characters, or rather flat characters, except perhaps the silent barber. And then we have evil men and good men, rewards and punishments, and magic rings and talismans, and so on. And though we are apt to think of mere size as being somehow brutal, yet I think there are many books whose essence lies in their being lengthy. For example, in the case of the Arabian Nights, we must needs think that the book is a large one, that the story goes on. We may never come to the end of it. We may never have gone through all the 1,001 nights. But the fact that they are there somehow lends a wideness to the whole thing. We know that you can delve deeper, that we can roam on and that the marvels, the magicians, the three beautiful sisters and so on will always be there awaiting us. And there are other books I would like to recall. And I think that one of the very first was Huckleberry Finn. I have reread it ever so many times since, and also Roughing It, The First Days in California, Life on the Mississippi, and so on. And now, had I to analyze Huckleberry Finn, I would say that perhaps in order to create a great book, perhaps only one central and one very simple fact is needed. There should be something pleasing to the imagination in the very framework of the book. In the case of Huckleberry Finn, we feel that the idea of the black man and the boy and the raft and the Mississippi and the long nights, those are somehow agreeable to the imagination. Those are accepted by the imagination. I also would like to say something about Don Quixote. That was one of the first books I ever read through. I remember the very engravings. And one knows so little about oneself that when I read Don Quixote, I thought I read it because of the pleasure I found in the archaic style and in the adventures of the knight and the squire. But now I think that my pleasure lay elsewhere. I think that it came from the character of the knight. I'm not sure now that I believe in the adventures or in the conversations between the knight and the squire, but I know that I believe in the knight's character, and I suppose that the adventures were invented by Cervantes in order to show us the character of the hero. And the same might be said of another book that one may call a minor classic. The same, I suppose, might be said of Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. I'm not sure I believe in the Hound of the Baskervilles. I do not believe in being terrified by a dog painted over with luminous paint. But I'm sure that I believe in Mr. Sherlock Holmes and in the strange friendship between Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. And, of course, one never knows what the future may bring. I suppose the future will bring all things in the long run. And so we may imagine a moment when Don Quixote and Sancho, Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson exist, though all their adventures, for all I know, may have been blotted out, and yet still men in other languages may go on inventing stories to fit those characters, stories that should be as mirrors to the characters. This, for all I know, may happen. And now I will jump over the years and come and go to Geneva. I was then a very unhappy young man. Supposed young men are fond of unhappiness. They do their best to be unhappy, and they generally achieve it. And then I was shamed because I discovered an author who was doubtless a very happy man. It must have been 1916 that I came to Walt Whitman. And then I felt ashamed of my unhappiness. I felt ashamed of having tried to be still more unhappy by the reading of Dostoevsky. And now that I have reread Walt Whitman, his biographies, I suppose that perhaps when Walt Whitman read his Leaves of Grass, he may have said to himself, "Oh, if only I were Walt Whitman, a Cosmos of Manhattan, the Sun." Because doubtless he was a very different kind of man. Doubtless he evolved, Walt Whitman, from himself, a kind of fantastic projection. And then, at the same time, I also discovered a very different writer. I also discovered, and I was also overwhelmed by him, I also discovered Thomas Carlyle. I read Sartor, Resartor. I can recall many of its pages. I knew them by heart. And Carlyle sent me to the study of German. I remember I bought Heine's Lyrisches Intermezzo, a German-English dictionary, and after a time I found I could dispense with the dictionary and that I could go on reading about his nightingales and his moons and his pine trees and his love and so on. But what I really wanted, and what I did not find at the time, was the idea of the Germanism. Because the idea, I suppose, was evolved not perhaps by the Germanic people themselves, but by a Roman gentleman, Tacitus. And I was led by Carlyle to think I could find it in German literature. I found many other things. I am very grateful to Carlyle for having sent me to Schopenhauer and to Hölderlin and to Lessing and so on. But the idea I had, the idea of men not at all intellectual, but of men given over, let us say, to loyalty, to braveness, to a manly submission to fate, that I did not find. For example, in the Nibelungen Lied, all that seemed too romantic for me. And I was to find it years and years afterwards in the Norse sagas and in the study of Old English poetry. There I found at last what I had been looking for when I was a young man. I found in Old English a harsh language, but a language whose harshness made for a certain kind of beauty, and also very deep feeling, and perhaps no very deep thinking. But of course, in poetry, I suppose feeling is enough. If the feeling comes through to you, that should be sufficient. I was led to the study of Old English by my inclination to the metaphor. I had read in Lugones that the metaphor was the essential element of literature, and I accepted that dictum. Lugones wrote that all words were originally metaphors. This is true, but it is also true that in order to understand most words, you have to forget about the fact of their being metaphors. For example, if I say style should be plain, then I don't think we should remember that style, stylus, meant an iron pen, and that plain means flat, because in that case I would never understand it. Now I will go back to my boyhood days and remember other authors who struck me. I wonder if it has been often remarked that Poe and Oscar Wilde are really writers for boys. At least the stories of Poe impressed me when I was a boy, and now I can hardly reread them without feeling rather uncomfortable over the style of the author. In fact, I can quite understand, though why remember this here since we are speaking of a man of genius, I can quite understand what Emerson meant when he called Edgar Allan Poe the jingle man. And I suppose that this fact of being a writer for boys might be applied to many other writers. In some cases it is unjust. In the case of Stevenson, for example, or of Kipling, for though they write for boys, they also write for men. But there are other writers whom one must read when one is young, because if one comes to them when one is old and grey and full of days, then the reading of those writers can hardly be pleasant. It may be a blasphemy to say that in order to enjoy Baudelaire and Poe, one should be young. Afterwards, it is difficult. One has to put up with so many things. One has to think about history and so on. As to the metaphor, I should add that now I see that metaphor is a far more complicated thing than I thought. It is not merely comparing a thing to another, saying the moon, like, and so on. No, it may be done in a more subtle way. I was thinking of Robert Frost. Of course, you remember the lines, "For I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep." Now, if we take the two verses, the first verse, "and miles to go before I sleep," is, I suppose, a statement. The poet is thinking of miles and of sleep, while when he repeats those lines, "and miles to go before I sleep," those verses are a metaphor. For miles, I suppose, should stand for days, for years, for a long stretch of time, and sleep, I suppose, should stand for death. Perhaps I am doing Frost no good by pointing this out. Perhaps the pleasure lies not in our translating miles into years and sleep into death, but rather in feeling the implication. And the same thing might be said of that other very fine poem of his, Acquainted with the Night. In the beginning, I have been one acquainted with the night, may mean literally what he's telling you. But in the end, after, one luminary clock against the sky proclaimed the time was neither wrong nor right, I have been one acquainted with the night, then you're made to think of the night as an image of evil, of sexual evil, I suppose. I spoke a moment ago about Don Quixote, Sherlock Holmes, and I said that I could believe in the characters, but not in the adventures, and hardly in the words that the authors put in their mouths. Now I wonder where we could find a book where the exact contrary occurred. Could we find a book in whose characters we disbelieved, but where we might believe the story? And here I remember another book that has struck me. I remember Melville's Moby Dick, because I'm not sure that I believe in Captain Ahab. I'm not sure that I believe in his feud with the white whale. I can hardly tell the other characters apart. And yet I believe in the story. That is to say, believe in it as a kind of parable, though I do not know exactly a parable of what. I suppose it should be a parable of a struggle against evil, of the wrong way of fighting evil. I wonder if there are any books of which it might be said. In the Pilgrim's Progress, I think I believe both in the parable, both in the allegory, and in the characters. This should be looked into, I suppose. Well, I remember the Gnostics said that the only way to be rid of a sin was to commit it, because afterwards you repented. And I think that as regards literature, they were essentially right. For if I have attained to the happiness of writing 4 or 5 tolerable pages after writing 15 tolerable volumes, I have come to that feat not only through the many years, but also through the method of trial and error. I think I have committed not all the possible mistakes, because mistakes are innumerable, but many of them. For example, I began, as most young men do, by thinking that free verse is easier than the regular forms of verse. Now I am quite sure in thinking that free verse is far more difficult than the classic forms. And the proof is, if a proof be needed, that literature begins by verse. I suppose the explanation would be that once a pattern is evolved, a pattern, for example, of rhymes, of assonances, of alliterations, of long and short syllables, and so on, you only have to repeat the pattern. While if you attempt prose, and prose, of course, comes long after verse, then you need, as Stevenson pointed out, a more subtle pattern, because the ear is led to expect something, and then it does not get what it expects, but something else is given to it, and that something else should be, in a sense, a failure and also a satisfaction. And so I should say that unless you take the precaution of being Walt Whitman or Carl Sandburg, then free verse is more difficult. At least I have found now, when I'm near my journey's end, that the classic forms of verse are easier. And another facility, another easiness, may lie in the fact that once you have written a certain line, that once you have resigned yourself to a certain line, then you have committed yourself to a certain rhyme. And as rhymes are not infinite, then your work is made easier for you. But of course, what is important is what is behind the verse. I began by trying, as all young men do, I began by trying to disguise myself. At first, I was so mistaken that at the time when I read Carlyle and Whitman, I thought that Carlyle's way of writing prose was the only possible one, and that Whitman's way of writing verse was the only possible one. And I made no attempt whatever to reconcile this very strange fact of having two opposite men having attained the perfections of prose and of verse. When I began writing, I always said to myself that my ideas were very shallow, that if a reader saw through them, he would despise me. And so I disguised myself. In the beginning, I tried to be a 17th century Spanish writer with a certain knowledge of Latin. My knowledge of Latin was quite slight. I do not think of myself now as a 17th century Spanish writer. And my attempts to be Sir Thomas Browne in Spanish failed utterly. Though perhaps I evolved quite a dozen fine-sounding lines. Of course, I was out for purple patches. Now I think that purple patches are a mistake. I think they are a mistake because they're a sign of vanity. And so the reader thinks of them as being signs of vanity. And if the reader thinks of you and he thinks that you have a moral defect, then there is no reason whatever why he should admire you or put up with you. Then I fell into a very common mistake. I did my best to be, of all things, modern. Now, there is a character in Goethe's Wilhelm Meister's Lehrjahre. The character says, well, you may say of me what you like, but nobody will deny that I am a contemporary. And now, I see no difference whatever between that quite absurd character in Goethe's novel and the wish to be modern, because we are modern. We don't have to strive to be modern. It is not a case of subject matter, of style. I suppose that if you look into Sir Walter Scott's Ivanhoe, or to take a rather different example, into Flaubert's Salammbô, you may tell the date when those books were written. Though Flaubert spoke of Salammbô as a roman carthaginois, any reader worth his salt would know, after reading the first page, that the book was not written in Carthage, but it was written by a very intelligent Frenchman of the 19th century. And as to Ivanhoe, we are not taken in by the castles and the knights and the Saxon swineherd and so on. We know all the time that we are reading an 18th or 19th century author. Besides, we are modern by the very simple fact that we live in the present. Nobody has discovered as yet the art of living in the past, and not even the futurists have discovered the secret of living in the future. We are modern, whether we want it or not, and perhaps the very fact of my attacking modernity now is in its way, I suppose, a way of being modern also. When I began writing stories, I did my best to trick them out. I labored over the style. Sometimes they were hidden under the many overlayings. For example, I thought of a quite good plot. And then I wrote the story El Inmortal. Now, the idea behind that story, and the idea will come as a surprise to any of you who have read the story, is the idea that if a man were immortal, then in the long run, and the run would be long, of course, since it would be endless, then in the long run, he would have said all things, done all things, written all things. And then I took as my example Homer. I thought of Homer, if indeed he existed, as having written his Iliad. Then Homer would go on living, and then he would change as the generations of men have changed. And then, of course, he would forget his Greek. In due time, he would forget that he had been Homer. And a moment might come when he would think of Pope's translation of Homer as being not only a fine work of art, indeed it is, but as being true to the original. But that idea of Homer forgetting that he was Homer, that idea is hidden under the many structures I wove around the book. And indeed, when I reread that story a couple of years ago, I found it a weariness of the flesh, and I had to go back to my old plan to see that the story would have been quite good had I been content to write it down simply and not to permit so many purple patches and so many strange adjectives and metaphors. Now, I think I've come not to a certain wisdom, but perhaps to a certain sense. I think of myself as a writer, and what does being a writer mean to me? It means simply being true to my imagination. That is to say, when I write something, I do not think of it as being true to fact, to mere fact, since mere fact, after all, is a web of circumstances and accidents, but of being true to something deeper. That is to say, when I write a story, I write it because somehow I believe in it, not as one believes in mere history, but as one believes in a dream or in an ideal, And I think that perhaps you are led astray by one of the studies I value most, the study of the history of literature. I wonder, and I hope this is not a blasphemy, I wonder if you are not too aware of history. Because being aware of the history of literature, or of any other art for that matter, is really a form of unbelieving, a form of skepticism. If I say to myself, for example, that Wordsworth or Verlaine were very good 19th century poets, then I may fall into the danger of thinking that time somehow has destroyed them, that they're not as good now as they were. And yet, I think the ancient idea was a braver one, the idea that perfection might be allowed to art without taking into account the dates. I have read several histories of Indian philosophy, and the authors, Englishmen, Germans, Frenchmen, Americans, and so on, always wonder at the fact that in India people have no historical sense, that they treat all thinkers as if they were contemporary, that they translate the words of an ancient philosophy into the, let us say, the modern jargon of today philosophy. But this stands for something brave. This stands for the idea that one believes in philosophy or one believes in poetry, that things beautiful once can go on being beautiful still. And though I suppose I'm being quite historic when I say this, since of course the meanings of words are changing, the connotations of words are changing, it's still I think that there are verses in Virgil, for example, I wonder if I'm scanning it as I should, because my Latin is very rusty. For example, I suppose that when Virgil wrote Ibant obscuri, sola sub nocte, per umbram, or that when an Old English poet wrote Nordans nude, and so on, or when we read, for example, music to hear, why hearest thou music sadly, sweets with sweets worn not, joy delights in joy, I think that somehow we are beyond time. I think that there is an eternity in beauty. And this, of course, is what Keats had in mind when he wrote, "A thing of beauty is a joy forever." We accept this verse, but we accept it somehow as a kind of right, as a kind of formula. And yet, sometimes I am, courageous and hopeful enough to think that it may be true, that though men write in time, that though all men are involved in the circumstances and actions and failures of time, somehow things of eternal beauty may be achieved. When I write, I try, as I have said, to be loyal to the dream, not of being loyal to circumstances. Of course, in my stories, people tell me I should speak about them. In my stories there are true circumstances. But somehow I have felt that those circumstances should always be told with a certain amount of untruth. I think there is no satisfaction in telling a story as it actually happened. We have to change things, even if we think them insignificant. If not, we shall not think of ourselves as artists, but perhaps as mere journalists or mere historians. Though I suppose all true historians have known that they can be quite as imaginative as novelists. For example, when we read Gibbon, I suppose the pleasure we get from Gibbon is quite akin to the pleasure we get from reading a great novelist. After all, he knew very little about his characters. I suppose he had to imagine the circumstances. I suppose he must have thought of himself as having created, in a sense, the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. And he did it so wonderfully that I do not care to accept any other explanation. So that, had I to give advice to writers, and I do not think they need it, because everyone has to find all things by himself, I would give them simply this one. I would ask them to tamper as little as they can with their own work. I do not think tinkering is any good. I think that the moment comes when one has found out what one can do, when one has found out one's natural voice, one's rhythm. And then I do not think slight emendations should prove useful. When I write, I think not of the reader, because the reader is, of course, an imaginary character. I do not think of myself. Perhaps I am an imaginary character also. I think of what I am trying to convey, and I do my best not to spoil it. When I was young, I believed in expression. I had read Croce, and the reading of Croce did me no good. I wanted to express everything. I thought, for example, that if I needed a sunset, then I should find the exact word for a sunset, or the exact, or rather the most surprising metaphor. And now I have come to a conclusion, and this conclusion may sound sad. The conclusion is that I no longer believe in expression. I only believe in allusion. Because after all, what are words? Words are symbols for shared memories. If I use a word, then you should have experience of what the word stands for. If not, the word means nothing to you. And I think we can only allude, we can only try to make the reader imagine. I think that the reader, if he is quick enough, can be satisfied with our merely hinting at something. And this makes, I think, for efficiency, and in my own case, it also makes for laziness. I have been asked why I have never attempted a novel. Well, laziness, of course, is the first explanation, but there is another one. I have never read any novel without feeling a certain weariness. I think that novels include padding. I think that padding may be an essential part of the novel, for all I know. And yet, I have read many short stories over and over again. And I find, for example, that in a short story by Henry James or by Rudyard Kipling, you get quite as much complexity and in a more pleasurable way as you may get out of a long novel. And I think that this is what my creed comes to. When I promised a poet's creed, I thought very credulously that once I had given 5 lectures, I would be made by the fact of having given 5 lectures, I would evolve a creed of some kind. But I think I owe it to you to say that I have no particular creed except those few precautions and misgivings I have been talking to you about. I try, when I'm writing something, I try not to understand it. I do not think intelligence has much to do with the work of a writer. I think that one of the sins of modern literature is the fact that it is too self-conscious. For example, I think of French literature as being one of the great literatures in the world. I don't suppose anybody could doubt that. And yet, I have been made to feel how the authors are generally too self-conscious. I suppose a French writer begins by defining himself before he quite knows what he is going to write. And so he says, what should, for example, a Catholic born in such and such a province and being a bit of a socialist write? Or how should we write after the Second World War? And I suppose there are many people all over the world who labor under those illusory problems. When I write, and of course I may not be a fair example, but merely an awful warning, when I write, I try to forget all about myself. I forget about my personal circumstances. I do not try, as I tried once, to be a South American writer. I merely try to convey what the dream is. And if the dream be a dim one, and in my case it generally is, I do not try to beautify it or even to understand it. And maybe I have done well, for every time I read an article about me, and somehow there seem to be quite a lot of people with that sort of thing, I am generally amazed and very grateful for the deep meanings that I have read into quite haphazard jottings of mine. And of course, I am grateful to them, for I think of writing as being a kind of a collaboration. That is to say, the reader does his part of the word, of the work. He is enriching the book. And the same thing happens, I suppose, when one is lecturing. You may think that now and then I have given a good lecture. In that case, I have to congratulate you, because after all, you have been working with me. Had it not been for you, I don't think the lecture would have seemed particularly good, or even tolerable. I hope that you have been collaborating with me tonight. And since this night is different from other nights, I would like to say something about myself, because I came to America 6 months ago. In my country, I am practically, to repeat the title of a famous book by Wells, I am practically the invisible man. And here I am somehow visible. Here people have read me. They have read me so much that they cross-examine me on stories I have forgotten all about. They ask me, why did so-and-so was silent before he answered? And then I wonder who so-and-so was, why he was silent, what he answered. Well, and then I hesitate to tell them the truth. I say that so-and-so was silent before he answered, because one generally is silent before one answers. And yet, all these things have made me happy. I think that you're quite mistaken if you admire, I wonder if you do, my writing. But I think of it as a very generous mistake. I think that one should try to believe in things, even if they let you down afterwards. And if I am joking now, I am joking, well, because I feel something within me. I am joking because I really feel what this means to me. I know that I shall look back on this night, that I shall wonder, why did not I say what I should have said? Why did not I say what these months in America have meant to me? What all these unknown friends have meant to me? But I suppose that somehow my feeling is coming through to you. I've been asked to say some verses of mine. I will go over a sonnet, the sonnet on Spinoza. The fact that many of you may have no Spanish will make it a finer sonnet, of course. And as I have said, that meaning is not important, that what is important is a certain music, a certain way of saying things. Maybe, though the music may not be there, you will feel it, or rather, since I know that you're very kind, you will invent it for me. Now we come on to the sonnet, Spinoza. Las traslúcidas manos del judío labran en la penumbra los cristales, y la tarde que muere, miedo y frío, las tardes a las tardes son iguales, las manos y el espacio de Jacinto, que palidece en el confín del gueto, casi no existen para el hombre quieto que está soñando un claro laberinto. No lo turba la fama, ese reflejo de sueños en el sueño de otro espejo, ni el temeroso amor de las doncellas, libre de la metáfora y del mito, la brunardo cristal, el infinito, mapa de aquel que es todas sus estrellas.